Hello students, welcome to the channel. In today's video, we look at the second passage of the reading section of the April 2021 SAT. This is part of the series of solutions that I have been uploading to this test. I'll link to them in the description box, so do check them out. This passage is adapted from Christian Jarrett. We have an ingrained anti-profit bias that blinds us to the social benefits of free markets by the British Psychological Society. So just from the blurb, I know that this is a social science passage, and it's about this ingrained anti-profit bias that people have, which Jarrett will speak about, and that how that blinds us to the social benefits of free markets, right? So the passage will also look at the social benefits, not just the economic benefits of free markets, but how they benefit society. According to a new paper in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, most of us have an instinctual anti-profit bias. We view for-profit companies and industries upon which capitalism is based with inherent distrust, assuming that the more profitable they are, the more harm they do to society. In fact, research shows the opposite is true. Companies that make greater profits actually tend to contribute more value to society, for example, in terms of their environmental responsibility and corporate philanthropy. So the first paragraph, the introductory paragraph, sets the stage for the discussion by saying that there is an assumption that profit-seeking companies are harmful, right? The basis of capitalism, that is, you work to make profit, that basis is instinctively looked down upon by most people. But if you actually go by the evidence, you would see that the companies that makes the most profits are also the ones that have the means to be environmentally responsible and do charity, do a lot of philanthropy, etc. The authors of the new paper, led by Amit Bhattacharjee at Erasmus University, believe this anti-profit bias leads many voters and politicians to endorse anti-profit policies that are likely to lead to the very opposite outcomes for society than they want to achieve. Erroneous anti-profit beliefs may lead to systematically worse economic policies for society, even as they help people satisfy their social and expressive needs on an individual level, they said. So this is interesting. There is sort of a distinction made between what a person, an individual who's interested in social justice believes and what his ideas may lead to on a society-wide level. So it is said that people who are interested in social justice, they are against, for-profit companies. They feel that for-profit companies are harmful, they are bad for social well-being. But in fact, even though that may give them satisfaction on an individual level, they may feel that they are doing something, which would be good in the big picture or in the long term. Actually, it's not. At a macro level, those policies, those ideas are harmful. The idea that capitalism is bad or profit seeking is bad. Through 7 separate studies involving hundreds of online participants, the researchers present evidence that the anti-profit bias arises because we think about for-profit motives in a somewhat superficial, egocentric fashion. Because the desire for profit is seen as based on selfish intent, we extrapolate to assume that the activities of for-profit companies and industries must be bad for society, disregarding the reality that selfish intents can have positive consequences. So this further develops the idea of the preceding paragraphs by saying that most people have this bias for a reason, right? Because when we think of profit, when we think of seeking profit, we think of it as an inherently selfish motive. And so we extrapolate that to the actions of profit-seeking companies and deem those actions inherently bad. But in fact, the selfish motives, selfish intents can have positive consequences. We also refer to our own mundane zero-sum experience, such as buying a car in which the seller's profitable gain inevitably comes at our loss. We fail to consider how market forces operate on a massive scale, in which for-profit companies competing in a free market with informed customers need to innovate, behave fairly, and develop a good reputation in order to be profitable over the long term. So this is a second reason for why we do not trust for-profit companies. One is obviously we associate the profit motive with something bad, with something selfish. And two, we look upon it as a zero-sum game. When we buy from someone, we think that it comes as a loss to us because obviously we have parted with our money. But if you look at it from the perspective of the company or the person or the business that has sold you something, you would realize that you need to be you need to have a reputation to be able to sell. You need to be innovative. You need to behave fairly. So if you do not do those things, and if you behave in ways that are looked down upon by customers, then you would not survive. So it is a little, in the author's perspective, it is a little disingenuous to suggest that anybody can sell anything without concern for the big picture. For instance, in the first study, participants rated Fortune 500 companies in terms of how profitable they thought they were and how much they thought they engaged in bad business practices, such as operating at the expense of others with no concern for society. There was a clear pattern. The more profitable participants thought a company was, the more they assumed that it engaged in bad business practices. In fact, expert assessments of the firms show the opposite pattern. So the first study had participants kind of, uh, you know, uh, rate companies in terms of how profitable they thought they were, and also rate them in terms of the kind of business practices they followed, whether they were healthy or harmful. And there was a clear correlation in the results obtained from the participants' data, but it's not true because experts think the opposite is true, which is to say that the for-profit world, the for-profit industrial world is in fact able to do the most benefit to society. So that's the first study. In another study, participants were presented with vignettes of different companies and either told they operated for profit or not for profit. Participants rated the exact same companies engaging in the exact same business activities as more likely to cause social harm and less likely to bring social benefit if they were described as for profit rather than not for profit. So this is interesting. In the second study, participants were just shown clips or data or stories or narratives about different companies. And even when every other factor was the same, just the fact that a company was for profit led participants to deem those actions as harmful. And if it was not for profit, participants deemed the same actions, the same stories, the same narratives as beneficial. Bhattacharjee and his team found that they could attenuate their participants' anti-profit bias. Attenuate is to weaken. They could weaken their participants' anti-profit bias if they prompted them to think about how a long-term profit motive could encourage greater product innovation and quality, better treatment of staff, and more concern for reputation. However, thinking this way doesn't seem to come naturally. Participants' baseline judgments about for-profit companies were the same as when they were actively encouraged to assume that companies face few choices and have no information about firms' reputations, which isn't the case in a free market, profit-driven economy. So this kind of brings another aspect of the research to the fore, which is to say that Bhattacharjee and his team of researchers, they were able to kind of weaken the participants' anti-profit bias if they got participants to consider the positive effects of a long-term profit motive, things like product innovation, better human resource planning, good treatment of staff, concern for reputation. But this was something which had to be kind of discussed and, discussed with and told participants. It wasn't something that came naturally. The natural instinct was to kind of think of for-profit companies as selfish. Right. The findings of an ingrained anti-profit bias, generally held regardless of participants' economic knowledge or political leanings. This was a US study, so it remains to be seen if the same anti-profit bias will be found in other cultures. So, so this was something which was, completely independent of how much participants knew of economics or whether they leaned left or right? This was the ingrained anti-profit bias was always true. And, the fact that I just wanted to discuss the last few lines of the previous paragraph. Participants' baseline judgments about for-profit companies were the same as when they were actively encouraged to assume that customers face few choices. So even in that hypothetical scenario where customers don't know about the companies, which never really happens in a free market, participants, had the same view as when they were told to think about customers having poor knowledge. So this idea of an anti-profit bias is deeply ingrained, is what the passage suggests. Okay, and then we have this graph. So we'll read the graph when the graph question comes. So let's start with question 11. The main purpose of the passage is to analyze research that claims to show that an erroneous view is less widespread than previously thought. Describe findings that show why many people maintain a specific illogical position even after recognizing its faults. Present data showing that a mistaken belief leads to negative outcomes for the people who hold it. Discuss studies showing that an inaccurate conception is firmly established within a particular population. Okay, so I think I like D, right? Basically, the study tells us that this idea of an anti-profit bias, which is inaccurate because you should not have it if you care about the long-term benefit to society, then this anti-profit bias is actually counter intuitive. It is counterproductive because it can lead to bad outcomes. But that inaccurate conception is firmly established within a particular population, where we are looking at Americans, right? Because the study was an American study. So D is good. Analyze research that claims to show that an erroneous view is less widespread than previously thought. That's not correct. It is quite widespread, right? So the passage establishes that. Describe findings that show why many people maintain a specific illogical position even after recognizing its faults. That's not the main point, right? First of all, I don't like the word illogical. It's a little extreme. This is more of a subjective study. It's a social science study. So I could say that it's an inaccurate position, or it's a position mm, that is not beneficial, but I wouldn't like the word illogical. And the other thing is that the focus is not on maintaining that position even after recognizing its faults. So B is not correct. Present data showing that a mistaken belief leads to negative outcomes for people who hold it. That is definitely not correct because there is no discussion of how these people themselves, the participants, are negatively affected by this. Okay, in context, the second paragraph, lines 9 to 15, mainly serves to. So the authors of the new paper, led by Amit Bhattacharjee at Erasmus University, believe this anti-profit bias leads many voters and politicians to endorse policies that are likely to lead to the very opposite outcomes, right? So this kind of presents the thinking that the researchers went into the experiment with, which is to say that, we wanted to analyze this anti-profit bias. We wanted to look at it, and we felt that it was important to look at it because this anti-profit bias is counterproductive. So it suggests a possible origin of the anti-profit bias. It highlights possible consequences of the anti-profit bias, summarize the scholarly consensus about the anti-profit bias. It suggests ways of overcoming it. I think B, right? Because that's the point. They talk about how this can lead to systematically worse policies for society. So they are looking at the potential consequences of this bias. The origin of this bias is not in this paragraph. That's in the next two paragraphs, right? Where we look upon, for profit as inherently selfish, and we talk about the zero sum game. So it's not A. There's no scholarly consensus that's discussed here. It's just this team that is talked about. And there's no discussion of the ways of overcoming this bias. As used in line 22, positive most nearly means. So I'm just reading from this line. Because the desire for profit is seen as based on selfish intent, we extrapolate to assume that the activities of for-profit companies and industries must be bad for society, disregarding the reality that selfish intents can have positive, beneficial consequences, right? So I'm looking at beneficial. So that's option C, right? It's right here. It's not about, because here the word positive is kind of presented as a contrast to harmful. So beneficial is the best word. It's not about certainty or appreciative, right? And it's definitely not about optimistic, right? So, right. The passage more strongly suggests that one overlooked influence on the behavior of for-profit companies is the fact that one overlooked influence on the behavior. Okay. Increases in companies' profits typically represent increased losses by consumers. It is in companies' financial interest to act in ways that people regard favorably. The leaders of many companies are aware of people's anti-profit bias. While companies themselves act in selfish ways, people working for those companies may not. So you can definitely eliminate C and D here, right? Because this is not something the passage brings up. The leaders' awareness of people's anti-profit bias and the employees of these companies not harboring that bias. Now, between A and B, you can see that B is a better answer because when people think of, so A is definitely not overlooked, right? A is brought up as this zero sum idea, but B is something that people tend to overlook. People don't think about how, if the company does something which is negative, it would affect um, its long-term bottom line. So it is in the company's interest to act in ways that people regard favorably. So that is something that is normally overlooked. So I think 25 to 28, right? Companies need to innovate, behave fairly, and develop a good reputation. So I like 25 to 28 as the evidence for that, for the part that is overlooked by, people when they think of companies and the anti-profit motive. Um, so 23 to 25 is the zero sum, which is evidence for option A, but that is not overlooked, right? We are looking at the one that's overlooked. So this is important to understand that just because A and C are true, A in 14 and C in 15 are true, that does not make them the right answer because the question is asking us for an overlooked aspect of the behavior of for-profit companies. Okay, as used in line 46, naturally most nearly means. So, however, thinking this way doesn't seem to come naturally, doesn't seem to come instinctively, right? That's something that the passage has spoken about. So intuitively, right? It doesn't come intuitively. It is something that has to be discussed. And, so what is the context here? That if you want people to think about the possible beneficial effects of for-profit companies' actions, you have to discuss it with them. You have to talk about innovation and employee benefits, etc. It doesn't come naturally, intuitively, instinctively. The other words don't make sense because we are trying to talk about an instinctive reaction. So it's not commonly, obviously, or simply. Okay, it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that compared with US people who are critical of capitalism, US people who are supportive of capitalism are likely to be more tolerant of socially harmful business practices by for-profit companies, better at reducing their anti-profit bias when prompted to think about long-term effects, equally bad at accurately evaluating for-profit companies' effects on society, less willing to concede that the desire for profit is a selfish motive. So this is C very clearly, because it's categorically given here that the findings of an ingrained anti-profit bias generally held regardless of participants' economic knowledge or political leanings, right? So political leanings is important because if you are somebody on the left, then you would be skeptical of capitalism, right? And you would kind of, I mean, the assumption is that you would be more likely to say that these companies' actions are harmful. But if you're somebody on the right, then the expectation is that you would be more supportive of capitalism and capitalistic enterprises. But that's not true. The passage says that didn't happen because um, regardless of political leanings, there was this anti-profit bias. So people who are supportive of capitalism were equally bad at accurately evaluating these companies' effect on society. And I would go with 46, 7, 8, 9, 50. I would go with 51 to 52, right? So that's option C, right? Right. 52 to 54 is about other cultures and whether this kind of thing happens in other countries and cultures needs to be investigated. So that's not the point. Okay, according to the figure, which industry did participants perceive to be the least profitable? Okay, so now we need to look at the figure. Relation between perceived profit and perceived societal value. So profit is on the x-axis, where 0 is the lowest, 3 is average, and 5 a lot more than average. And societal value, 0 if they do not exist, and 3 important and useful. So least profitable would obviously be the one to the extreme left, which is book publishers, right? They are the least profitable. So that will be A. Based on the figure, which choice most accurately summarizes participants' views of the society value of the pro sports industry? So you can see that the pro sports industry is like the most profitable, right? It is definitely the most on the extreme right in terms of these points, but it is also the lowest in terms of societal value, right? So this kind of goes with what the participants in the passage think about this, inherent bias against profit-seeking enterprises. So while the industry has below average societal value, it has more societal value than the cell phone industry. That's not correct. Although the industry has relatively little societal value, society would not be better if the industry ceased to exist. That's not something that the passage brings up. We're not talking about ending industries, right? That's a little beyond the scope of the passage. The industry is inaccurately regarded as having little societal value. No, that's not correct. Participants would say that this does not have societal value. The industry would have more societal value if the industry were more profitable. D is also wrong because obviously that goes against. So C and D are definitely wrong. Is it B? I thought B was a little extreme. Although the industry has relatively little societal value, would not be better. Hmm. Hmm. Oh, interesting. Are we looking at no, but it makes more profit, no? It is more profitable than cell phones. So then it would definitely have less societal value. Yeah, so it's not A. Hmm. It's kind of, I'm not sure of this. Although the industry has relatively little societal value, society would not be better if the industry ceased to exist. That doesn't make sense either because participants' views, right? So participants, see, if you have to summarize it, you would say that participants would think of pro sports because it is like very profitable. It would, the idea would be that it would have less societal value. That's the participants' view. So it is accurately regarded as having little. That is, so this is out, and it would have more societal value if it were more profitable. That is also out. So C and D are definitely out because they don't summarize the participants' view. Now, although the industry has relatively little societal value, society would not be better if the industry ceased to exist. Are they talking about that somewhere? The fact that hmm, yeah, it engaged in bad business practices. So society would be better if the industry. So it's not B. Hmm. And what about A? While the B is out, while the industry has below average societal value, it is more societal value than the cell phone industry. How? You can't say that, right? Because selected industries. This is definitely, let's see. This question is a little hard. Yeah, so it is pro sports, cell phones. Cell phones is less profitable and so has higher. Would have more the no. Although the industry has relatively, I'm not sure of this, but I think I'll go with B because that's the only one that could be true, right? Because A is definitely wrong, right? It does not, it is more profitable than cell phones, so it definitely has lower societal value than cell phones, according to the participants. And therefore, C and D are also wrong. I don't think they talk about finishing industries anywhere. Yeah, does it say that anywhere that you should finish it? Yeah, so I'm not sure of this, but yeah, but I'll go with B. Okay, let's check this. Where is it? 1 second. Yeah. We have to check from 11 to 20. Yeah, this is what we need to check. Okay. DBC, DBC, BDDC, BDDC, and CAB, CA and B, right? Yeah, but I'm not sure of B. Why B? Society would not be better if the industry ceased to exist. Is there a part where they talk about it somewhere? Hmm. I don't think they talk about that, but I think it's safe to assume that this is some, they don't talk about not existing, right? That's not something that comes up. But that the industry itself kind of vanishes, right? So because A, C, and D were definitely wrong. So I think this is one of those questions where you can kind of come to the answer through elimination, right? Okay, so that was the social science passage of the April 2021 paper. I will upload the rest of the passages soon, so check those out. Come back later. I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.